Welcome back. You're still watching DayBreak, and I told you that we have Nora Mbagathi, Executive Director, Katiba Institute. Good morning.
Good morning.
Irungu Houghton is the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. Good morning.
Morning.
And you're waking up to what the stories are this morning, and I want to highlight what is on the Standard. Shameless top cops, ongoing investigations into what is increasingly appearing to be the deliberate killing of teacher and influencer Alberto Ojwang, are exposing lies by IG Douglas Kanja, DCI boss Mohamed Amin, and police spokesperson Mushiri Nyaga. This comes even as Kenyans pile pressure on DIG Lagat to resign. And this has intensified from the political class, from human rights advocates, including Irungu Houghton, who was attending Next Space last evening. Irungu, so you've seen so much the past 1 week or so, and had so much as well. Contradictory statements coming from the police bosses, all the way from the very first day when IG Kanja indicated that Ojwang may have been involved in self-harm leading to his death. As late as Saturday, we see the CCTV footage of the police officers reporting to Mbagathi Hospital with the body of Ojwang, meaning that he had died even before he was taken to that hospital. What are we dealing with here, and what are some of the situations that will come out with at the end of this investigation and action?
I mean, obviously, this is probably one of the lowest moments I think that the National Police Service have experienced. I mean, it is a moment where, I think public faith and confidence in the service is at its lowest. As Amnesty International, we, a decade after the Constitution came out, we published a poll that looked at I guess what were Kenyans' experiences of the police. And one of the things they told us was, something like 1 in 2 Kenyans feared the police more than poverty. And I remember at that time in 2020 thinking how terrible it was, given that in 2010 Kenyans voted for a new vehicle. They wanted a new police service. And, the articles 243 and 245 were very clear. Mm-hmm. And if you allow me just to read this section, because I think at a moment like this, we're actually wondering why do we have the police? People have called for the defunding or the disbandment of the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, and people are at the verge, I think, of calling for the disbandment of the police. But I think let's remind ourselves, under the Act and the Constitution, it says the National Police Service should strive for the highest standards of professionalism and discipline. It should prevent corruption and promote transparency and accountability. It should comply with constitutional standards of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it should foster and promote relationships with broader society. Now, every one of those clauses looks so remote today. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, where did this start happening? I mean, obviously, there are individual police officers that were responsible for the killing of Alberto Ojwang. They did this either on the instruction or, the turning of a blind eye of their superiors. But I think there is a pattern of systemic abuse that has led us to this moment. And I think, you cannot, not see in this moment all the different things that have happened. When Rex Masai and the 65 protesters were killed in 2024, this moment was created. When Bob Jaggi and the Longton brothers were abducted and held for 30 days, and up to now, nobody has been held responsible for their abduction. This moment was created. When the 19-year-old Charles Owino and 4 others were killed and were shot, and their bullet-ridden bodies were taken to the mortuary, and they were booked in as accident victims or victims of mob violence. This moment was created. When police officers were instructed to go to the streets to uphold peace and avoid goons from taking over the demonstrations, and were told that they must go not in uniforms, not with badges and service badges, but with essentially hoodies and masks. This moment was created. And I think what we have to say is that, police, over the last 2 years, the police have been instructed by the executive to essentially operate unlawfully. And what has happened is that that culture has now turned into a situation where the police are taking the law into their own hands. And essentially, in this case of Alberto Ojwang, if we believe the story that he was arrested essentially for false information, what we now have is essentially death in custody. But it's not the individual officers alone who should be under scrutiny at this moment. It has to be the culture of policing that we've seen over the last 10 years, and particularly over the last 1 year.
And Nora, when you listen to all the testimonies, because you've seen both houses of parliament speaking, the word they used is interrogating the police bosses because they oversight them, contradictory statements, independent policing oversight authority has also been speaking. What is the value of that, knowing that too well justice will eventually come through completing the investigative process, but also taking it to court?
Yeah, I mean, the value really lies in creating and gaining back that kind of trust. I think also what Irungu was referencing in terms of breakdown, a systemic breakdown of what we're looking at when it comes to policing. I think when we talk about IPOA, when we're talking about the investigatory process, we really need to look at, as a society, do we have faith in our police? And I think, you know, the report that was referenced, that Amnesty did, it really highlights that faith no longer exists. And it's not that we need a new police force. It's not that we need a different, you know, kind of regulatory system to govern police, but actually those rules and those systems, they do exist. And in fact, we need to ask ourselves, you know, why is the police not abiding by them? Can they explain to us what it is that makes them not feel that they are subject to, in fact, these laws that govern them? We've gone, as Katiba Institute, we've gone to court multiple times and have had issues affirmed, right, on how police should be regulated, on how police needs to be governed. We've done this with partner organizations, and others have gone to court as well. And the courts have been very clear. They've been very clear about what the rules are and the limitations are to how police can act, and who the responsible bodies are essentially governing, again, investigations. There's been a clear judgment on IPOA being the ones who should be looking into these issues. Now, of course, the issue as well is IPOA actually put in, you know, in the position in terms of finance and in terms of other support to actually properly do that. That is another issue. But ultimately it comes down to really, re-establishing this faith. The police is intended as a service for us. It's not, in fact, intended as something that is meant to attack us on behalf of the state. It is a service, and I think it's telling that in the 2010 Constitution, it went from being a police force to being a police service. And so is that, in fact, what they are doing? Are they serving us? Are they, you know, acting as our protectors? Are we able to rely on the police in the way that we should? And I think the answer there is no, and I think that's where really those investigations and those you know, assessments have to happen.
And you speak of independence of the police from the state. Is it possible in the circumstances?
I think it is possible. The question is it wanted, and who is pushing against it, right? I think, again, we see in the country right now, there is such a push and such a desire for accountability, right? For a police force that we can rely on. It's a really important, crucial, vital part of what makes up, you know, the fundamental fabric of a society is that reliance on those bodies. And so I would say, yes, it is absolutely possible. We have the frameworks, we have the Constitution, we have the different acts that, you know, that establish how the police is meant to function. But again, what are the steps that need to be taken? We know, for example, you know, Irungu referenced the way in which police is also meant to establish a better relationship with the communities around. There is meant to be, and has meant to be for a very long time, county policing authority, right? There's supposed to be a direct relationship between counties and policing, and there's supposed to be that trust, again, between communities and the police. But that doesn't currently exist. It is possible, but steps need to be taken in order to ensure that that happens.
Irungu, you started in that one of the conversations by candidate William Ruto as he was gunning for the presidency, when he was making the promises about ending extrajudicial killings, and that would never happen during his tenure. And eventually he came in, one of his first acts was to give independence of budget control. Well, he said that's what it was. We don't know whether it is. Why has it been so difficult to achieve that?
Yeah. So I think there have been a number of signs that we have seen as human rights organizations, and I'm sure the public have seen them also. I think it's one thing to declare that the budgetary authority or the independence of the budget is there, but I think it's another thing for us to hear that there are units that operate outside the chain of command. I mean, when you have an Inspector General saying, these are not my officers, and the Inspector General is mandated by the Constitution, by the Police Service Act, essentially as the command and control over the entire 100 or 100,000 plus police officers. And when he says that these abductions are not taking place under my instruction, then I have to say that, we are at a place where, unfortunately, we're back in the Jubilee administration and the things that the President Ruto talked about under President Uhuru Kenyatta. We have returned back to the secret squads, the idea that there are officers who are being instructed not by their superiors, but by other people who are more powerful than their superiors. And therefore, the chain of accountability is utterly broken. And I think that's the challenge that we have, is that, a lot of the human rights abuses that we saw, the arbitrary arrests, the enforced disappearances, the killings, and not all of them were in police custody. Now we have killings in police custody. So I think we are seeing a slide towards, deeper human rights violations, almost by the month. And, who knows what's going to happen this week. I mean, I think if I was in the National Security Council, I would really be asking very tough questions about how do we navigate the next couple of weeks, particularly the anniversary of the 25th of June, in a manner in which we do not see more body bags, we do not see more cover-ups, we do not see the public begin to feel that this system of policing no longer has their trust. And therefore, ultimately what happens is a sense of lawlessness begins to develop, where people say, well, if the police can break the law, why shouldn't we be allowed to break the law? And there's a one step from authoritarianism to anarchy. And every time we see a death like the one of Albert Ojwang, essentially what happens is you radicalize a number of people because they say, well, the police aren't abiding by the rule of law, why should we? And then we lose everything.
And Nora, how do you excuse the inconsistencies in the testimonies that are being given by the police? Because the first day, IG Kanja, self-harm. When they appeared before the Senate, they said that Ojwang was unconscious. But now it's appearing from the medical report that he had been dead and cold. And Mbagathi Hospital just advised the police officers to take him report to the Kenyatta National Hospital police station and thereafter to the mortuary. What does this do to integrity of that leadership, and what should happen? Is it excusable, really?
Yeah, I think really to your question, it is not excusable. There is no justification for why information is being drip-fed in this way, and for why information is being shared that is incorrect or misinformed, differently aligned. We need to get clear answers to the questions that are being asked, and it doesn't need to be a, well, okay, now they have found out this, so then we will, now tell them this. That's not how accountability works, and that's not how investigations should work. So it is really not excusable. I think there are clear questions as well around what kind of evidence is released and what kind of statements are being made. And again, it really goes to this question of, can we trust? Can we trust the police services? Can we trust the entities that are tasked with overseeing these police services as well, and the individuals who are in those roles? And so it is absolutely not excusable, and it will continue to create a momentum in the country that really. Yeah, that will, as Irungu, I think, said, that will move towards an anarchical state almost, if there isn't that feeling that even when people are coming forward and saying, yes, something has happened, something does need to be investigated, and it's still not the full clear picture, and we're still finding out new information on an almost daily basis, that's just inexcusable.
Irungu, so when you have such a situation, I remember when the current Director General of the NIS was the DPP, Nurdin Haji, and he said that there are several files that have been taken to him and subsequently to court that would appear that the evidence was not sufficient or it was erroneous. In fact, there are some cases that had to be withdrawn, especially touching on impropriety of embezzlement of public resources. So if that was a problem, and now you have the police bosses unable to account for facts, how much more challenges are we dealing with? And can we really rely on the evidence adduced by investigating officers in most of these issues?
I mean, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years requires the public to remain vigilant. I mean, I don't think we would be in this current situation where, the issue of Albert Ojwang is on every day. Every day it's in the newspapers. I mean, it's on the top of the news hour. Yep. If the public interest had not been maintained. And I'm sure that the officers that picked him on that Saturday afternoon a week ago were not in any way clear that this would be an issue that would embroil not just themselves, their commanders, but the entire National Police Service. I mean, to have a situation where the public are beginning to scrutinize every single word of the Inspector General, the spokesperson, the Director of Criminal Investigations, and the Independent Oversight Authority is actually quite remarkable, because Kenyans are now clear that they have to get involved in policing. And it is actually, if you think about it, it is unnecessary. If the police were following the law, we would not have reached this point. But unfortunately, we are there now. One statistic I think we cannot forget at this point is the statistic that, out of the 60 cases that the Independent Oversight Authority have been investigating, only 2 have found their way to court in the cases of the killings of protesters last year. And I think, 2 out of 60 is just too low a number. And that's why there is skepticism around this particular case. I think the other thing that people have noticed, besides the inconsistency of the timeline, and just to say that, on Sunday afternoon, for the best part of the day, the Law Society president, the family, other lawyers were at the Central Police Station asking for information. And the entire day, there was nobody that was willing to tell them the truth. And the truth was that Albert Ojwang was in the mortuary. He had been there for several hours, but nobody had the courage to just come and explain what was happening. And that's when I think Kenyans began to feel that there is a cover-up, right? So I think, as the case unfolds, as the investigations come to a close, and we start to see several officers come to court, there are a number of things we must demand. We must demand, for example, that all the officers that came into contact with Albert Ojwang, they are persons of interest. They need to be arrested, they need to be investigated, their gadgets need to be handed over, and the time log, the phone logs and the vehicle logs need to be handed over to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. I do believe, as I think the religious leaders now have spoken yesterday, and I think the family of Albert Ojwang has spoken also yesterday, that DIG Lagat needs to step down. He's stepping down not because he is guilty, but because he respects the reputation of the National Police Service. And for many Kenyans, essentially, he is a person of interest until the courts prove otherwise. And for him to continue would be essentially to jeopardize the reputation of the National Police Service. So I think if you're watching DIG Lagat, I would strongly urge you, not because of guilt, but because in moments like this, one steps down to allow a process to be impartially, investigated and concluded.
Why wouldn't he? Because he hasn't all this time.
That's a question you have to ask him. In fact, if you invite him to the show, I'm very happy to sit with him and we could talk it through. But I think it's an important point. It's not just about his personal, liability in this case. It's really about what do you do under Chapter 6 of the Constitution, right, when your reputation is smeared at this moment. You step aside. I mean, to have had him in a press conference with the Inspector General a week ago, essentially talking about this case was just, patently wrong. And I think the police have suffered as a result of that.
And Nora, so there's a young man, 23-year-old, who was arrested for having taken some 3,000 shillings to manipulate the CCTV cameras at the Central Police Station. And some have been saying, I mean, why do you have him? It's just about 3,000 shillings. Just talk to us about the seriousness of what he may have been involved in.
Yeah, the seriousness, it comes down to the overall case, right? It comes down again to the cover-up, to the way in which the investigation of all this is hampered. I think ultimately it does, we do need to look beyond someone like that, and we need to look at who are actually the authorities responsible for all this, who is behind this. I think that is a crucial piece. We need to look at the structural and the systemic issues around this, and again how we can realign the police and the people in authority positions with the roles that they're meant to have under the Constitution. But of course, every individual person who is involved in this cover-up, who is involved, in this, again, drip feeding of information, in the reasons why we can't have the full picture, why we can't have the full evidence, all of that, it goes back to that point of, how can we create a true line of accountability here?
Right, and of course, we're still talking about the question of what the police have been able to do the past few days. And Irungu, soon it will be 25th. And there's a story that we ran yesterday in the bulletin about a gentleman from Nyeri County, Daniel Nderitu, 37-year-old, whose leg was amputated after suffering 2 gunshots on, it is the left foot. He continues to recover, but watching that story is so heartbreaking to an extent that he says that he has now gone into drinking. The wife was saying that on several occasions he has to threaten her that he's going to take his own life. These wounds, how do we deal with this? Because the very first time I saw an acknowledgement of even Parliament of the deaths of Gen Zs, it is just the other day when the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury was presenting the budget highlights, calling the House to a moment of silence. What shall we do for accountability in that?
I mean, it's heartbreaking. And as Amnesty International, we published a book in December called Lest We Forget. It's on our website. It's about 25 testimonies of survivors and victims' families. And really, when you listen to those cases, it's just heartbreaking in the sense that many of the people who have been caught up in this are people with very humble means. They like Albert Ojwang's mother, they talk about how this has shattered their income. This has shattered their home. It's shattered their future. And it's not just those that have survived. It's also those that are around them. I mean, I think like the case of Nderitu's wife and family, it's changed their lives forever. And one needs to ask is how much trauma can this country survive? How much can we go through without us really being, a society of mass trauma where there is PTSD on a mass scale? Because many of the people that we now know as household names are people that have scarred us. I mean, we all know the cries of Rex Masai's mother and father up to this day, the first that fell, and we have an inquest, but we don't have a judgment that either exonerates or incriminates the officer who shot him that day, that the first to fall in terms of the protests. So I think one of the things we have to recognize is that we are essentially creating a pattern of historical injustices in the current moment, right? So, it's the same kind of judgment calls that were there in Wagala, and the same kind of judgment calls that were there in Shakahola recently, or in Yala. Today, we are creating those tensions in our society. And my biggest fear is that as we move to the 25th of June, we will not have learnt any lessons. Neither will we have found justice for the people who have died or have been injured or have disappeared and never been found. But the worst thing is that we are actually creating the seeds for the next round of trauma.
A very disturbing reality there. As we continue with this conversation, just the other week, I think it's last week, that the report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee came in showing that there had been reforms or reviews to the money allocated to the National Police Service. And 1.8 billion shillings is the extra amount that, after consultations, was given. 800 million shillings going to the Office of the Inspector General. But there was also an interesting figure of about 150 million shillings going to the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, the Forensic Lab, and they term it as Optimus 3.0 social media. When we asked around, we were told that this is a software that can be used to track social media users. Well, we're not certain about that because it looks like also it's a placeholder for something else. When you asked Parliament, they told us that Optimus is a powerful OSINT, which is open source intelligence platform that helps monitor and investigate online activity across social media, forums, and even the dark web. It can build detailed profiles of persons of interest, track conversations by keywords, and uncover links between accounts and content. This helps identify threats, fake profiles, or criminal activity on platforms like Facebook, Telegram, and others. This is a message from a parliamentarian who would know. Now, while this is okay to deal with the criminals, what are the risks and what is the real value of some of these software programs in the hands of the police?
Yeah, it was such a telling moment, I think, for this to be released and for this information to be made clear in terms of the budgeting and how much of that was going towards these kinds of ultimately surveillance mechanisms, right? I, fully see and agree with you in terms of, certain types of criminal activity need to be investigated and there needs to be the ability to do so. But when it comes down to a mechanism that also allows you to track how people are expressing, how their constitutional right to free speech, how they might be expressing themselves on online platforms, how they are acting, in a realm in which there should be freedom of speech as well as privacy. There are real questions around that. I think, we've already had a number of people talk about the ways in which also telecommunications companies are involved in sharing information with security forces and what their role is in this breakdown of accountability. And so it really seems, critical that at a time where someone who has been killed, who has been arrested for online content, is that really the time where we want to say, yes, let's reduce the education budget and let's really go hard on figuring out what people are doing online? Like, I think we need to ask ourselves, then why is that happening and how does that relate to our constitutional protections and the rights that we have under the Constitution?
Irungu, your take about that, Optimus 3.0?
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear. I don't think it's Optimus 2.0 that they're actually trying to buy. I suspect it is different software because when we looked at, we've got a technology and human rights team that looked at what is Optimus 2.0. And I'm not sure we would be spending 150 million, but let me leave it for the moment because we're still looking into it. I think what we need to recognize is that this trend that Nora is speaking about, which is the trend towards mass surveillance, is unfortunately very persistent within this particular administration. And they are, I think, misusing the National Assembly to push through a number of legal frameworks. Not just that, but if we go back to the Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes Act and the 4 or 5 clauses there that essentially have been struck down by courts several times, but continue to be used by police officers. Or, for example, the amendments to the Information Act that basically seek to give every single gadget a particular ID or a unique identifier, so that they can see who is actually sending out information, who is communicating. And then I guess the third one is, even in the finance bill at the moment, there is a proposal once again to essentially circumvent the Data Protection Act so that they can get access to our our taxation data, not just in terms of what we declare, but even in terms of the e-money platforms that we use at the same time. So I think, this tendency towards mass surveillance is extremely dangerous. And I keep pushing back to the administration and to members of parliament and saying, imagine this technology in the hands of your worst enemy, right? Or in your political opponent. What would you have developed? And I think the problem with politicians, they tend to have the memory of tortoises, if I can be slightly prejudicial towards tortoises, which is essentially they don't think that one day they will have to deal with an administration that's trying to deal with them. So I think we have to push back against this. And it's not just the work of human rights organizations. Citizens need to pronounce themselves on the finance bill, particularly in terms of this new set of allocations to the police.
You might find that tortoises are very thoughtful. Now, so as we close, so 127 billion shillings is going to the National Police Service. You can imagine such an amount of money, but a year later, you don't have accountability for Gen Z killings. So what is one thing that you want to see going into the future?
I would want to see the police abide by by the Constitution and the rules that are governing upon that they are governed by. I would want to see the establishment of the county policing authority that has, years ago it should have already been established. I would want to see IPOA properly, resourced and being able to properly take out their functions, their investigatory functions. I would want to see accountability. I would want to see evidence being shared when it becomes available and when things are known and when it needs to be out there. So I would want to see, back to your first question, is it possible to have a functioning and accountable police service in this country? Yes, it is, and that is what I would want to see.
Irungu, same question. What must we see now?
So I think, starting off with the case of Albert Ojwang, I think his family and the nation needs justice. So I would like to see the arrests of officers. I would like to see that court trial be fair, impartial, and swift, so that we can bring this horrible incident to an end. I think I would like to see, the 60 cases that IPOR are investigating brought to court. I think that the protesters that were killed or were injured or were abducted, I think those cases have to be concluded. I think I would like to see very deep systemic reforms within the police service, some of which I think Nora has raised. But I think the other thing is an end to the assault on civil liberties, the right to expression, the right to assembly, the right to organize. And lastly, perhaps I would like to see us return to a society that does not criminalize online speech and essentially use unlawful means to subject people to some of the most horrible cases. And we've sadly almost forgotten Rose Njeri, right? And I think, the way that she was treated over those 88 hours is really a precursor. It licensed the kind of violence that we saw in Albert Ojwang. So each incident is part of a pattern that is building that has to be interrupted and disrupted, not just by the executive, by the National Police Service, but also by the National Assembly and the public.
Some of those killings of Gen Z, it appears that the Kenya Defence Forces was involved. IPOA doesn't investigate KDF. How do such victims get justice? So
I think you're raising an important point, whether we need to look at the act that constitutes the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, because I think there are probably two areas there. One is expanding their mandate to focus on all arms of government that are involved in law enforcement. The KDF are essentially fall under the responsibility of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights need to be much more assertive in terms of following that side of, I guess, what we call policing function. I mean, it seems strange, for a liberal democratic country to continue talking about the military in the context of policing, but we must not forget that the deployment of the police, of the military, is still in place 1 year since the storming of Parliament.
Right, and I have to thank you both for making time for us. Nora Mbagathi, Executive Director, Katiba Institute, and Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. Thank you for your time. Up next, when we come back, we'll be speaking to Ken Gishinga, who is an economist from Mentora Economics, and also Ibrahim Ocheng, Senior Program Officer, Budgeti Hub, and Dr. Nelly Bosire, Consultant Obgain and Health Policy Advocate. We'll be talking about the budget 2025 and some of the funding in the critical sectors and what you need to think about as we look into the next financial year. We are back in a moment. Stay tuned.